And actually, if you take away social media for some kids, their depression's going to get worse.
When you are sleep deprived, unfortunately, it does increase the risk of suicidality.
Kids are asking to be seen and asking for support in a way that I think that they weren't doing before because we just weren't even talking about it.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades. But a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each week, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, how can we address the teen mental health crisis?
We weren't medicating the whole world yet. We had no idea what experiment we were walking into.
Brooke Siem was 15 years old when she started taking antidepressants. It was 2001, just a handful of years after Prozac was approved by the FDA. It was the first in a new family of antidepressants that soon flooded American medicine cabinets. In 1 decade, starting in the 90s, antidepressant use among teens and adults quadrupled. Brooke Siem got swept into that wave.
I think the biggest reason why I was medicated was out of fear. In 2001, I was 15 years old, and my father suddenly passed away. And so the adults in my life were concerned that I wasn't really grieving or processing. I was just pretty much shut down. And my mother did what she thought was the right thing. She took me to a child psychologist who ultimately diagnosed me with a depressive and anxiety disorder and recommended medication. So my mother had gone from having, a full family to losing a third of it. Her primary person who she would bounce things off of, ideas off of when it came to me, was gone. And I was and am an intense person who feels things really deeply. And I think she was worried that if there was not an intervention, that she might lose me too. And so I ended up at a child psychiatrist because, again, my mother was just trying to do what she thought was right. And within, a short appointment, 5-10 minutes, I was given a prescription for an antidepressant. And had we known what was going to happen and the consequences of these drugs, I don't think either one of us would have made the same choice.
Since Brooke Siem took her first antidepressant, use among teens has grown steadily. It spiked during the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, overall mental health among Americans young and old took a nosedive during the pandemic. But the trend among teens has been worrisome for at least a decade now. Starting around 2012, suicide overtook homicide as a leading cause of death among 15 to 19-year-olds. The murder rate jumped during the pandemic, and now they're virtually tied. In the most recent big survey of high schoolers that the CDC does every few years, 1/4 of students said they had seriously considered suicide. And nearly half reported feeling persistently sad or hopeless. So today on Top of Mind, how can we help youth struggling with anxiety and depression? Let's look at 3 areas for possible intervention. We'll tackle the role of sleep. 2/3 of American teens are chronically sleep deprived. And we'll look at the effects of social media, which seems like an obvious culprit, but outright banning it could actually make things worse for some kids. First, though, let's talk medication. A lot of doctors and families recognize that it's often an effective part of mental health treatment. I personally have taken antidepressants for years. But others worry that we are too quick to jump to prescription medications, particularly for kids. That is Brooke Siem's fear, and one she only realized in hindsight.
It was given to us in such a benign way that it was kind of like, why not? Who wouldn't want to not feel horrible? I had 2 drugs that I had tried, and they both gave me very, very obvious, immediate physical side effects. I was either couldn't stay awake in school, or I was so nauseous and my heart was racing. So we ended up putting me on a combination of Effexor XR and Wellbutrin XL, which were not approved for use in children and teens in 2001 and still aren't. approved for use in children and teens, but nevertheless, I stayed on those same 2 drugs for the next 15 years.
Now, many of the antidepressants given to teens over the years have not been formally approved for use in kids, but have been shown to be safe and effective in studies done outside of the FDA approval process, so it's legal for doctors to prescribe them. In Brooke Siem's case, the drugs seemed to trigger some new health problems.
Within a year, I had developed a whole host of other physical issues. I had something that was diagnosed as bile reflux disease. My thyroid started going nuts. My skin was going nuts. And we just assumed that these were all independent. No one ever, in any of the specialists I saw over the course of a couple of years, suggested that maybe the antidepressants were actually causing these effects, these downstream effects, because it was gradual. And so what happened was I ended up being put on a whole bunch of other drugs in order to deal with the physical issues that had come up. So, I can't say for sure whether or not it was the psychiatric drugs that caused these side effects, but I think there's a line to be drawn in between the fact that when I got off the psychiatric drugs and I got off these other drugs, the issues did not return.
How did the drugs affect your mental health? I mean, that was the reason that you had gone on them, right? Did you feel less depressed, less anxious? Were you better able to cope with your father's death?
No, not really. I just kind of felt numb and not home, which I guess could be a definition of feeling better. I mean, depending on, the thing that you've gone through, you don't want to feel that pain. So I guess by that definition, I did. But I was also gone and not home. Like, it just started to cut off all of my intuition, all of my curiosity. It really, I had no affect really up or down, so therefore there were kind of no consequences. So every decision I made started to come through this lens of not only a numbing affect, but also through a lens of brokenness. Because here I had been told by all these people I'm supposed to respect and who have more training than I am that there's something fundamentally screwed up about my brain and that it's not my fault. I felt like the drugs gave me an excuse to not make an effort, to not thrive, to not deal with hard things.
15 years later, she's 30 years old and really not feeling well.
I was having a lot of suicidal ideation, and it just kind of dawned on me one day that if the antidepressants were working, I shouldn't be this depressed. And I realized, my father died at 15. I'm about to turn 30. That means that I'm entering the period in my life where I will have lived more than half my life without him. And by that same token, it means I will have lived more than half my life under the influence of a lot of drugs and a lot of powerful psychiatric drugs. And I realized that I hadn't had an unmedicated moment in my entire adult life. And given how miserable I was, that just seemed really deeply uncomfortable. And it made no sense because I was like, I don't wear the same clothes as I did when I was 15. My brain has changed. Why in the hell am I on the same cocktail of medication?
So she quit taking the antidepressants. She says her doctor told her to just stop instead of tapering off.
Given what I know now, I don't think that was a smart recommendation. And that's when I was plunged into severe antidepressant withdrawal. And my whole life changed. All I can say in a succinct way is just that these drugs affect absolutely every part of your body. And so for me, quite literally within about 6 days of getting off the drug completely, I started having very intense changes to all 5 of my physical senses.
Her thoughts of suicide intensified. She had relentless intrusive thoughts, gut problems, mood swings, and sensory changes. And this went on for more than a year.
I didn't really start to learn resilience until I went through antidepressant withdrawal. It's just, that is where my issue is that we are not teaching people how to handle life, and instead we are just giving them a drug. In hindsight, what I needed was time. And what I needed was for my mother, I think, to get help for herself. In which she has, and she did. We have talked extensively about the choice to medicate me and the consequences. And we both agree that had we known what we know now, we certainly would not have made the choice we made. I had gone through a major trauma at a very young age. And the reality was my life was not going to be derailed if my GPA dropped from a 4.0 to a 3.5. And if I needed to take some time, that's what should have happened. I should have just been given the time to work through it, and my grief should never have been medicalized. And when you have not been fully feeling your feelings because you have been medicated since you were a child, you do not have the tools to manage difficult life situations. And then you get overwhelmed, and then you take an anxiety drug, and we just end up back on the same treadmill.
Brooke Siem's memoir about her experience with antidepressants is called May Cause Side Effects. In 2004, not long after Siem first started taking medication, the FDA issued what's called a black box warning for antidepressants, saying that they were associated with an increased risk of suicidal thinking, feeling, and behavior in young people. Doctors quickly started prescribing less.
I mean, it definitely gave me pause.
This is Khadijah Booth Watkins.
And I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and I'm the associate director for the Clay Center.
While the black box warning prompted a lot of primary care doctors to stop prescribing antidepressants to teens, many psychiatric specialists, like Dr. Booth Watkins, dove into the FDA's data first.
It definitely made me want to learn more about it, again, to be able to understand what this meant, how they came about this decision. And there was enough there that made me feel comfortable that the risk of untreated depression is far greater than the risk of this potential suicidal ideation.
The FDA had based its black box warning on an analysis of hundreds of clinical trials done on antidepressant use by people of all ages. The increased risk of suicidal thinking or behavior was only significant for patients under 18. And it was just 2 percentage points higher than for patients who took a placebo. Plus, says Dr. Booth Watkins,
the idea or definition of suicidality was extremely broad. And so it obviously looked like people thinking or, having suicidal thoughts, but it also could look like a kid who was angry and kicked the trash can on the way out the door. So anything that was potentially self-harming was considered suicidal thoughts. And it's also important to note that there was no acts of suicide or anyone attempting to take their lives. These were all thoughts.
In other words, in the hundreds of studies that prompted the FDA's warning, no one actually died by suicide. So Dr. Booth Watkins felt comfortable continuing to carefully prescribe antidepressants to her young patients. And within a few years, many other doctors followed suit. Antidepressant use among teens is much higher now than it was before the black box warning. Dr. Booth Watkins says it's a trend to watch carefully, but not necessarily cause for concern.
I mean, I think we should always be mindful of that and always be watchful. And mental health conditions among young people are so incredibly prevalent, more prevalent than strep throat. So it's encouraging that we're now identifying kids that need treatment and giving them the treatment that they need. And so I think this trend has shifted because there was a period of time before the black box warning, we were seeing decreases in depression, decreases in suicidality. And then the black box warning came, and it wasn't that we were curing kids. It wasn't that there was no more depression. It's just that now we were afraid to use the medication that also could potentially have a similar side effect that we're trying to avoid.
And now things are ticking back up since the pandemic. Things have sort of...
And we're more educated. We're more kind of thoughtful about thinking about the risk versus the benefit. Because again, having an untreated kid with depression could potentially be life-threatening.
So describe for me a patient situation where you would really be recommending medication. What would have to be in place for you to say, yeah, I really think we ought to add some meds to this mix?
I mean, definitely if we're dealing with safety concerns and issues in terms of increasing aggression, suicidal ideation, or even suicidal, behaviors. But also if kids are incredibly depressed, they don't have any energy, they can't make it to school, they're no longer wanting to play on the sports, they're no longer enjoying things they used to enjoy. They're having suicidal thoughts, even if it's passive, like I just wish I weren't here, maybe life would be better without me. And so when you have a kid coming in and they're suffering, there's impairment in their functioning at home or school, when a child misses 6 months of life, meaning misses because they're physically absent or missing because they're withdrawn and they're isolated, missing because they're just not mentally present, but they're so preoccupied with their thoughts or their worries. This is huge. Thinking about missing, the first half of freshman year of college or the first half of, freshman year of high school or transition from middle to high school, those are big milestones. Even when we think socially, like the social circles and kids change so dramatically and so quickly. If you're missing, you've missed out.
Dr. Booth Watkins, do you find yourself more often encouraging parents to try medication for their kids or trying to discourage them from the medication that they sort of came in thinking was the answer?
This is a little bit tricky because often by the time they reach me, things are pretty severe. So usually it is me making a medication recommendation, and it's never really medication in isolation. It usually is medication plus some sort of therapy because pills aren't skills. But, I have not seen a child in my practice in the clinic that I felt like, well, I don't understand why they're here. They don't all need medication. But they all need some sort of support. So while I might say to them, I know you came here to talk about medication, but I really think this is something that doesn't meet the level in terms of when we think about risk versus the benefit. I really think that we should try these steps first. And of course, if you want to come back and talk about it some more, like if these symptoms aren't going away and it's getting in the way of life, then we should talk about it again. So all of the kids that come to see me don't necessarily require a psychopharm intervention, but they require something.
What are some of the specific skills that you're really keen to see these young people that they just really need to have in order to be well mentally?
So one of the things that we talk a lot about is really how do we build resilience? It kind of sounds like a buzzword, but it's real. Resilience helps us to not be so impacted by adversity, but it also helps us to, if we are impacted, to really be able to bounce back without so much disruption in our lives. And so if we are doing things like maintaining connection, like meaningful connection, and that was partly what made COVID so difficult. We weren't able to keep those connections. We had to take time to figure out how to reconnect in a safe way. But also things like, teaching kids how to be flexible and see a different perspective, how to regulate their emotions. So that would look like us as adults, showing how we regulate our emotions when we're angry, showing what coping skills we use. While acknowledging like we're human and we sometimes also get angry.
What are some of the concerns that you're hearing from parents and patients? So when they come to you and you're having this conversation about we need help, what are some of the more common questions and concerns that they voice?
As it relates specifically to the medication, there's no medication without risk, without potential side effects. And at the core, they're just worried about safety. Is my child going to be addicted? Is it going to change their personality? I have a friend who has a son and maybe, they look like a zombie the last time I saw them. Is that going to happen to my child? And will they need it forever? Are there alternatives to this? Like, is there something else we can do instead of medication? How long is it going to take to work? Like, these are the questions that they want to know. They want to have all of the information that they need to make the best decision for their child.
What does working look like? How do you know that the medication is working well enough to continue with it in a teenager?
Ideally, you want a teenager to be functioning at like 98, 99, 100% of their best self. I'm not as sad as I used to be, but I'm still sad. That to me is not the definition of working. I'm not as anxious as I used to be, but I'm still anxious. I still can't do certain things. I'm still avoiding certain things. That's not working. Working is that the symptoms are resolved. Again, recognizing that some of these things are natural parts of life. We're naturally wired to be anxious at times. We're naturally wired to be sad when sad things happen. These natural emotions are okay. But, you want them to be living their best life, going to school, socializing with friends, doing extracurricular activities, thinking about their future, not being irritable, not being on edge, in a way that is consistent. So
I was going to say, where is this magic medicine? No irritability.
It does not exist. It does not exist. And that is different from every day, like cranky. We're walking on eggshells. We don't know what to say because it's never the right thing.
Yeah.
That's very different.
What if on the medication, it's not walking on eggshells all the time, but it's kind of numbed out, kind of like you're not having the the intensity of that, but it's also, their affect has changed, or they're sort of a zombie, right? Is some of that sort of just inherent in antidepressant use, that it's intended to sort of flatten things out a little bit? And is that acceptable? And, does that look like working in your mind?
Yeah, we don't want to make any zombies. That is definitely not the definition of working. And whether it is an antidepressant or a stimulant for ADHD, that is, to me, a side effect and an undesired and an intolerable side effect.
So do you think it's important then that there be a reassessment, or like how common would you say it is that a teen might go on it at 16 and then suddenly they're 28 or 35 and they've kind of always been medicated? Maybe it's working, maybe it's not, but it's sort of like, once I was on this train, I was kind of on it, Is that a common thing?
So there should always be a constant and ongoing assessment and reassessment of how things are going. And definitely, if there's been sustained progress, then there's a period where we start talking about, let's talk about discontinuing the medication. I typically go down slowly in the same way.
You step down dosage.
Right. So we step down, and so that usually makes it tolerable. The medications that have a shorter life, it feels more like a jolt, but typically stepping down in small increments over an extended period of time usually kind of mitigates that outcome.
So what is giving you hope right now when you look at the state of your patients and what you can offer them?
I mean, first and foremost, what gives me hope is that patients, families are talking about mental health and mental illness. They are open to having conversations about how we can best support these young people. And the fact that kids are just feeling empowered to advocate for themselves and to be able to talk about how they feel. I can't tell you how many kids come into my office and parents are like, well, I say, why are you here? And they turn and look at the kid and they're like, well, they said that they wanted to come in for an evaluation. Kids are asking to be seen and asking for support in a way that I think that they weren't doing before, because we just weren't even talking about it in the same way that we're talking about it now.
Dr. Booth Watkins, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate you inviting me to talk about this topic that is so important.
Khadijah Booth Watkins is a child psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital and associate director of the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds. So that regular CDC study of teens that I mentioned earlier found that in 2021, almost a third of high schoolers reported that their mental health was poor all or most of the time in the past month. Now, that study also found
only 23% of high schoolers were getting at least 8 hours of sleep on school nights, and that's the minimum they should be getting. So we know that the highest risk of suicide is during those preteen to young adulthood years. And we also know that teens tend to be the most sleep deprived of any age group.
How does sleep impact the mental health of American youth? And are our assumptions about teenagers and sleep getting in the way of a potential solution? That's coming up on Top of Mind. I'm Julie Rose. Hey, Top of Mind listeners, I have another podcast I want to recommend to you. It's from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, and it's called The Appleseed. It's a show filled with stories for you and your family. Each episode features master storytellers sharing all kinds of stories: folk tales, fairy tales, personal and family tales. So it's perfect for road trips, for bedtime, or really anytime you're looking for something that the whole family can enjoy together. And the stories you'll hear will likely get your family sharing their own stories with each other, which is really the best part. It's the payoff. So listen to The Appleseed wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Lisa L. Lewis. I am the author of The Sleep-Deprived Teen. I am a parenting journalist. I'm a parent, and I have also become a teen sleep expert these last several years. This specific topic of teen sleep really hit our household in a big way in the fall of 2015. And that's because that was when my oldest of my two kids, my son, was entering high school. And at that point in our local public school district in California, high school started at 7:30 in the morning. So that was super early. It was earlier than I had gone to high school way back in the day. It was also earlier than any of the other start times he'd had going through the system. So I could see, just as a parent who was the person driving him to school every day, we were leaving the house at 7:10, he'd be sitting there in the car next to me, but he was pretty quiet and subdued. He was hardly what I would call alert and ready for a full day of learning. So it was pretty obvious that this just was not an optimal time for him, and it really quickly was starting to feel too early, for me too.
Were there other parents having the same concerns? Like when you started asking around, was anyone else sort of being like, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. What I found was that everyone was just sort of, in a sense, quietly suffering. You have to get your kid to school at whatever the established start time is. And so there were some parents where it turned out, they were having issues. Their kid was chronically tardy because they just had the hardest time getting their kid up in the morning. Some parents were doing like not taking a first period, or perhaps taking a class online, which you could do asynchronously. So, these kind of workarounds existed, but that was in response to a start time that was far from ideal, and the sleep loss that, the parents were seeing in their teens as a result.
Things came to a head when that same year her son started high school, the school district experienced a cluster of suicides.
When something like that happens, when there is a suicide, or God forbid, more than one, the ripple effects are huge. So in the community where we lived, it was absolutely a case where if you didn't know the family directly, you knew somebody who did. Sleep absolutely is a component of mental health, and when you are sleep deprived, unfortunately, it does increase the risk of suicidality. That's one of the first questions that a medical professional will ask when they are talking to somebody who is suicidal, because when you have gotten enough sleep, it does sort of boost your emotional resiliency. The flip side, when you have not gotten enough sleep, it does exacerbate symptoms of depression, anxiety, suicidality, and there actually has been shown to be a dose-response relationship, that as sleep goes down, the risk of suicide goes up. And so, of course, as a parent and a parenting journalist, I started looking into it and wanted to find out more about why it was that our high school started so early. And what I quickly expanded to was the research on teen sleep deprivation, because sleep is so important for emotional resiliency. If you haven't gotten enough sleep, things are more difficult across the board. Your emotions run hotter, and it's much harder to kind of maintain that sort of an emotional base of stability. That's even more so for our teens, because they're also in the midst of this major phase of brain redevelopment. And so what that means is they don't yet have the benefit of a fully functioning, fully mature prefrontal cortex the way we do as adults, because that's what helps temper that increase in emotionality. And our teens are in the midst of this multi-year process of brain redevelopment, in addition to everything else, all the massive transformation that's going on during the teen years. So in a sense, they're even less well equipped to deal with sleep deprivation.
Now, the solution here might seem pretty simple. If teens have to get up early for school, they should just go to bed earlier. And yeah, that occurred to Lewis.
But there are a couple of basics to keep in mind when it comes to teen sleep. The first is teens do have this shift to a later sleep schedule.
A teen's circadian rhythm changes during puberty. Melatonin, which is the body's natural hormone to cue sleep, starts to release later at night and lasts later into the morning.
So because of this change in the timing of when melatonin is released, teens are not feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock at night. That's very different than the natural bedtime for a younger child. So you can't just put a teen to bed at 9 o'clock, as if you could just do that with a teen anyway, just, enforce a bedtime. But unless they're incredibly, absolutely ongoingly sleep deprived, they're just going to lay there and stare at the ceiling. The other piece, though, is that teens need more sleep than we do as adults. they start looking like adults, but they are not yet adults, and they don't yet have adult sleep needs. So up until age 18, teens should be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep every single night. 8 hours is the minimum. So when you keep in mind how much sleep teens should be getting, the fact that their sleep is often squeezed on both ends with early start times in the morning, activities and homework load and all the other things that they're doing, you can see how difficult it can be for them to be getting enough sleep. The body of research on teen sleep actually goes back to the mid-1970s. That's when the first really interesting teen sleep study was done at Stanford. And I've got a chapter about this in my book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen. It was called the Stanford Summer Sleep Camp, and it was actually set up to be fun so that for the kids it sort of, loosely resembled being at summer camp, but it was actually a long-term sleep study. And that's really when some of the first insights were gleaned into the fact that teen sleep was different than kids' sleep.
The sleep camp ran for 10 years, and the same group of kids and teens came back every summer to sleep in a dorm outfitted as a sleep lab.
And when I talked to one of the former campers, who of course now is an adult, he really remembered it fondly as being a lot of fun. They'd go and play volleyball, and they'd go bowling and things like that. But the whole time they had these electrodes attached to their heads.
The electrodes were glued to their faces and hair with these wires dangling off. So these kids would spend their days running around campus with their camp counselors, who were mostly undergraduate student researchers, and these electrode ponytails dangling from their heads. Amused Stanford students who caught glimpses of the kids on campus nicknamed them the Trodes, says Lewis.
And it was really sort of funny to envision what it must have been like. So every 2 hours, they would go back, they would take naps, and they would measure how long it took them to fall asleep, if indeed they did fall asleep. They'd be measured all night long. And what they found there was that when they went in to wake them at 8 in the morning, the kids would all be awake. The teens, though, would not. And this was sort of that first inkling into the fact that teens are on this later sleep schedule.
Finding out about the Stanford sleep camp was an important moment in Lewis's research. There she was in 2016, dragging her groggy son to high school at 7:30 in the morning. And here the science had been around for decades, showing that teens need to sleep in later. Then she learned that the American Academy of Pediatrics was already on the record back in 2014, recommending that middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 a.m. And yet the average start time for public high schools across the nation at that time was 8.
What it turned out was that these schedules were formed in many cases decades ago as a result of school districts' desire to save money and use one fleet of buses for the drop-offs and pickups at elementary and middle and high schools. And so when they were first doing this, the research into teen sleep wasn't as widely known. And so as a result, often by default, the high schoolers were put in the earliest time slot, the thought being, oh, well, they're the oldest, they should be better able to handle this. Now, of course, we know that it's actually the exact opposite, that because of this circadian rhythm shift that takes place, high schoolers should be going to school the latest. So from there, my involvement just sort of snowballed. One of the articles that I wrote was an op-ed that ran in the Los Angeles Times. It was called Why Schools Should Start Later in the Day. And it happened to be read by one of our California state senators. And it just so happened that his daughter's school was in the midst of conversations about school start times. So it was an issue that resonated with him. He decided to start looking into the issue further with an eye towards introducing a bill on the topic. And that's exactly what happened.
The bill would require California middle and high schools to start at 8:30 or later. The state PTA supported the plan, but there was also a lot of opposition. Coaches worried how later start times would affect sports practice. Many parents were fatigued at the idea of having to rearrange their schedules.
Often the natural response is, oh gosh, please no, not another change.
The state teachers union and school board association also opposed the bill, preferring to leave start times up to local schools and families. Ultimately, the governor vetoed it. And after a few more years of wrangling, a proposal to start high school at 8:30 and middle schools a bit earlier at 8 a.m. made it through the legislature and was signed into law by a new governor.
So California was the first in the entire country to do so. Second state, which did so last year, is Florida. There's a 3-year implementation window, so it doesn't go into effect until 2026. But once that happens, the impact in terms of the number of students who will benefit from this is huge.
What difference has it made since 2019 when California passed that law that said that all high schools can't start any earlier than 8:30 and middle schools can't start any earlier than 8 a.m.? Has it really made that much of a difference?
So this is only the second school year that this has been in effect. However, I can tell you that consistently when these school districts have been studied after the fact, when they've moved to later start times, they have found time and time again that students get more sleep. They found the teachers were as well. So just as a data point, there was one district in Colorado, Cherry Creek. They made this change in 2017. And what they found was that high schoolers were getting an average of 45 to 50 minutes more sleep as a result. And that's huge.
Really?
I mean,
it doesn't sound that huge.
That, almost an hour, 45 to 50 more minutes sleep. Well, if you think about setting your alarm and getting up deliberately 50 minutes earlier tomorrow than your natural wake time, you will probably notice a difference. And that kind of magnitude is actually a tremendous improvement when you talk about change. It's not an incremental, 5-minute change. 45 to 50 more minutes makes a huge difference.
Yeah. So Lisa Lewis, besides trying to find a school that starts later or trying to get your school to start later, are there other things that parents can think about doing to improve the quality of their teens' sleep?
Tech use can be a huge piece of this equation when you're talking about not just mental health, but also sleep. And of course, the 3 are so closely intertwined. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no tech use an hour before bedtime. Well, what do you do in that hour instead? Build in some wind down time and specifically a wind down routine. So use that hour before bed to help make that transition. And maybe it's reading an old school book. Maybe it's listening to music. Maybe it's taking a warm bath or doing some sort of, meditation. And then, of course, ideally having them be the driver of this, because particularly as our kids get older, we're not going to be as involved in every aspect. And they need to figure out what works for them. They need to help develop these habits because ultimately we will not be there to say, lights out.
Lisa L. Lewis is a parent journalist and author of The Sleep-Deprived Teen, Why Our Teenagers Are So Tired and How Parents and Schools Can Help Them Thrive. Thank you so much for your time today, Lisa. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you so much.
When researchers ask parents to list concerns that they have about their kids, 2 issues tend to come out on top: mental health and technology use, especially social media. And for many, the 2 are connected. Most parents think social media makes children's mental health worse. But
if you take away social media for some kids, their depression's going to get worse.
So what is social media really doing to teens? That's next on Top of Mind. I'm Julie Rose. Hey friends, if you are looking for another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, check out Constant Wonder. Host Marcus Smith takes you on an exhilarating journey through captivating stories of our magnificent natural world. You'll gain profound insight into different facets of our planet, discover more about nature, and maybe even ponder your connection to Earth's wonder. The show is Constant Wonder, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Sarah Coyne, a professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University, has become one of the most prolific researchers on how social media affects teens. But it almost didn't happen.
I remember I had a student, his name was David Grant, undergraduate student at BYU, and it was probably about 2012-ish, who came to me and said, this Facebook thing is a big deal. We should do research on it. And I was like, okay, I guess. So we did a little study. I think it was about romantic relationships on social media, and turned out to be a huge, huge part of my research because now I do lots and lots of research on social media. Obviously, it did not go away. It's a thing. It's a very big deal right now.
Yeah. In hindsight, it's like, it's a good thing we got on the train.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you have some expectations going into it of some assumptions that you were making about what you would find
Sure. So as a researcher, you always have hypotheses, right? It's good science. So we expected that higher social media use over time would be related to higher depression and anxiety, and the effect might be stronger for girls than boys. So those were our hypotheses.
Did they all play out the way you expected?
No, they did not.
Okay, so let's break this down. There is a lot of research out there showing that social media use correlates with worse mental health outcomes for teens. That's why social media CEOs keep getting grilled by Congress, and dozens of states are suing the companies for endangering young people. But those findings typically come from comparing large groups of young people and looking for trends in their social media use and mental health. Sarah Coyne has done those studies too.
And when we looked at comparisons across people, we found similar things that other people had found. Yes, there was a correlation between time spent on social media and depression and anxiety. However, we did something really unique in this study. It's called within persons. And what that means is I'm able to look at my own individual change. So I, Sarah, over time, I can say, okay, if in a particular year I'm using social media at really high levels, you might expect the next year my mental health would be worse. But then I get it under control and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to use less social media. So next year, you'd expect my own depression, anxiety would also decrease. So we were able to look at that within person on that individual level. And that's where everything fell apart. We didn't find anything that we expected. So time spent on social media was not related to depression or anxiety over time on an individual level across the entirety of adolescence.
Her findings were only possible because she got in on the ground floor of a pretty unusual research study.
It was called the Flourishing Families Project. It involved 500 adolescents in the Seattle, Washington area. And we followed them from about age 10 until about 21. And we were able to look at longitudinal impacts of social media across the course of adolescence, which is a pretty unique data set at the time.
Interesting. So does that mean that social media is just completely harmless then?
I think that'd be super naive to say that, right? What I took from that study is it's not necessarily about time, right? Because, think about all the different ways we use social media. So I'll take us again. I don't know what you do on social media, Julie.
But I do a lot of scrolling.
All right. Let's say you do a lot of scrolling. Let's say you do a lot of doom scrolling. And let's say you're getting cyberbullied and you're posting your podcast and then you're like, nobody even listened to it. That's so mean. Right?
Or they don't like the way we did it.
Or they don't like the way you did it or fill in the blank, right? So you're having these negative experiences. Let's say you spend an hour doing that. Okay. And let's say I spend an hour on social media, and I'm having these amazing experiences. I'm connecting with my family that live in England. I'm talking to old friends. I feel uplifted and happy, and, so it's not necessarily about time. It's perhaps about the way we use it. And that's, what we're trying to look at now.
Why is this not the story that we're hearing so typically out there in the world, though? The message is, generally speaking, social media is terrible for you no matter what. Why do you think that's the case if what you're finding is that actually it's way more complicated than that? In some cases, social media can be good for you.
Social media is a really easy scapegoat. So, these are companies that are making billions of dollars. It's really easy to want to blame them, right? When we see this mental health crisis and say, aha, you're the easy villain. Let's just get rid of social media and everything will be fine. And nobody wants to hear about, it actually is really nuanced and complex and depends on the teenager and what they're doing. And actually, if you take away social media for some kids, their depression's going to get worse.
Like what would be that situation?
So let's say you've got a kid, and this is what we found in our study, comes from a really chaotic home, okay? They've got parents that aren't really very nurturing, kind of dismissive, and so just tough life. And so what we think, right, for this particular group, when they go on social media, they can have more positive connections, they feel a place to belong, cope with some of the stress that they feel at home, and so on.
So they're finding communities.
Yeah, they're finding community and belonging.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it kind of is a replacement for what they're missing out at home. And so they do a lot better than, say, kids who don't use social media at all. So their depression and anxiety is lower, right, for this particular group.
The implication there then is that broad policies can cause harm in some kids. And in some cases, it's kids who are at particular high risk for other really negative life outcomes.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we did another study where we looked at transgender and non-binary adolescents and their use of social media and mental health. And we asked them all sorts of questions, but the one that stood out to me is we asked them how often they were taking intentional breaks from their phones. For cisgender kids, taking intentional breaks from your phone was a good thing, related to less depression and anxiety. For transgender non-binary kids, taking breaks from your phone and social media specifically related to way higher depression and anxiety. These are a group of kids that are really high risk for depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and so on. And if we've really dug deep and explored, we've done focus groups with these kids, and they report such a sense of community on social media. They're often the only trans kid at school. They're often bullied. They're often rejected by their family. And so social media becomes really, really important. And so when we tell kids, just get off your phone, just use your phone less, that's good advice for many kids, but it could be devastating for other kids. And so you really need to understand the context behind what's going on.
What else have you found from your research creates a problematic scenario? What populations of teens and what types of uses can lead to problems?
We know that adolescents that are more prone to making social comparisons online tend to have worse outcomes, but there's a range, right? So it's not like every child is making social comparisons all the time. So for example, something we're exploring in our research right now is who is going to have the worst experiences on social media in terms of body image and who's going to have the best ones. And we haven't analyzed this yet, but I can tell you our hypotheses, right? You might expect, so let's say a girl who is really high in social comparison, perhaps she's following a lot of accounts that are a little more problematic in nature, so really highly filtered. Maybe she's even getting to some of the pro-anorexia sites, right, that exist that are just so damaging. You're going to expect that girl is probably going to have some really negative experiences that might relate to poor body image, disordered eating, or so on.
What do you think about the outright bans or some of the approaches that we've seen so far? Aside from some kids being harmed by it, do you think, for example, like a parent might want to consider just keep your kid off social media until they're 21 or till they're 18, till they leave your house, kind of a thing, right?
I mean, it totally depends on the kid and the parent, right? And I'm not going to tell anyone what to do. I'm in general against banning social media. I know that, so I'm from Utah, and there was a lot of talk about banning social media in the state for anyone below the age of 18. And it's a little too late. I think the best analogy for me is driving a car. We don't just give teenagers a car and say, go for it. We train them up. You have to take classes, you have to practice, you have to do the time to learn how to be a safe driver. And then we also install safety features in cars, like seatbelts and airbags, to make them safer for people who drive it. And I feel like that's a nice way to look at social media, right? Again, it's just a tool. It can be used for good or for bad. If we don't train our adolescents and kids, they're going to crash and burn. Social media is such a huge part of adolescent life right now. And I feel like a lot of this is legislators just talking to each other without talking to teens themselves. And I really worry about that. When you actually talk to teenagers, right, they'll talk about some of the hard things. And they'll also talk about some of the great things, right? So I was talking to my daughter yesterday about Snapchat, and I know that's one that's banned in a lot of households.
How old is your daughter?
She's 16, and she uses it all the time, right? And she said, people don't even text anymore. We're all just communicating on Snapchat. And I was like, what? When did that happen? She's like, I don't know. If I wasn't on Snapchat, I would miss out on a huge piece of the social world right now. And so the conversation for me and my daughter say, instead of banning it, because there are crazy things that you can do on Snapchat for sure, right? We should have a lot of conversations about using it in safe ways and then keeping that line of communication open. So when something crazy does happen, and it has, that she comes to me, and then we learn from it, and then we grow and we move forward. And hopefully then this builds her up as a user of social media, so that when she's 21 and out of my house, she's had all this experience behind her with me kind of scaffolding, that's a developmental term, so that she's able to go out and be okay. It's scary though, Julie, it really is scary. So something that I've talked about quite a bit with our legislators in the state of Utah is requiring digital literacy classes specifically on social media. We have some like how to use a computer and don't give out your passwords, which is great. But I think this needs to be taught from the age of like 5 and 6 about how to be a healthy media user. I think it is so important right now. It's got to be consistent, it's got to be early. And so we're giving them the tools so that when they do have a social media account, we know it's like 95% of teens have a social media account. Yeah. They can do it in a way that's a lot safer and benefits their mental health.
It's like what are some of the specific things that you've worked with your teenagers on being able to do with their social media use? Do you know the groups that your kids are following and who they're talking to on social media? Do you think parents should, know the passwords and sort of frequently be kind of looking over their kids' shoulders at their social media activity?
I did that for my first kid, and it kind of backfired on me. Yeah, and I found that he was creating fake accounts and trying to get around me. Yeah. And I'd put more limits on, and it would backfire. And we were fighting about it all the time, and he was getting into all this content anyway. And I was doing this study, and it was this national study on adolescents, and it was looking at parenting around media, right? And it found that those parents that had the strictest rules around media actually had the most depressed kids, most anxious kids. And I realized after I published that study, I'm like, I need to back off a little bit. And so I'm friends with him on all the accounts. That he's 19 now, so he's an adult. But at the time, I think he was 16, 17. Backed off. I'm still friends with him, but there were less limits. And I just worked on our relationship. And I noticed he started coming to me more about some things he was seeing. And I got our relationship back, and that mattered more to me. So I've given my current 16 and 13-year-olds who are both on social media a little more autonomy. But again, we do a lot more of that discussion, critical thinking, talking than me just monitoring everything.
Do you handle it differently with your 13-year-old and your 16-year-old?
Yes.
13 might sound young to some parents out there.
Yes, for sure.
What are your thoughts on, and what have you found in your research and then in your personal experience with regard to younger teens and social media?
Yeah. So I think for a younger kid, when they're first getting on social media, you kind of want more of that scaffolding in place, have more limits, have more rules, be more present, and then kind of back off. Again, we don't hand the keys to the car to the kid that first day. So, and maybe this is what I want to end with, right? As a parent, none of us think we're doing it right. What we find in our studies is that most parents feel really guilty over this topic. We all think we're messing up somehow, and we all worry our kids are on social media too much, right? Realistically, we're doing better than we think we are. And when we study depression and anxiety and media and all these things, the number one predictor of healthy kids is the parent-child relationship. It's if you're being a warm, involved parent, that tends to predict lower levels of depression and anxiety far more than the amount of time social media does. So if you're there for your kids, if you're working on that relationship, talking to your kids, keeping that open format, they'll most likely be okay. And they'll come to you when there's problems. You're doing better than you think you are.
Sarah Coyne is a professor of human development at Brigham Young University, studies the effects of media on kids and teens. Thank you so much for taking time today, Professor.
You are very welcome.
Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Vanessa Goodman and James Hoops, with help from Samuel Benson, Sam Payne, and me. Our audio engineer and sound design team includes Brandon Lewis, Kelsey Ney, Carly Wilson, and Trent Reimschüssel. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.